everyone virtually and in the audience. Thank you so much for attending. I'd like to introduce you to our second to last session of the evening, Circular Economy in Guernsey. And I'd hand over to our moderator for this session, Rosalie Aslop, the Director of Communications at Guernsey Finance.
Thank you so much. Oh, do I need this? No. Okay, thank you. 2 mics. Everybody comfortable? Okay. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rosie Alsop. I'm Director of Communications at Guernsey Finance. And today we're going to be discussing the circular economy in Guernsey and Guernsey's path to creating a world-leading waste reduction and recycling programme that has embraced and supported the circular economy model. Our panellists this afternoon will be focusing on waste reduction, resource optimisation and sustainable practices, and talking about how Guernsey has built a waste strategy that sets global standards. We'll be discussing the challenges that we faced in developing a circular economy approach and some of the systems that have been put in place to better support community practices. And this afternoon, I'll be speaking with Deputy Lindsay de Sommeray, Steph Glover from Guernsey Finance, my colleague, and Peter Barnes from the States of Guernsey. So I'm going to hand over and let you guys introduce yourselves one by one. Lindsay, would you like to start, please?
Yes, hi, I'm Lindsay de Sommeray. I've got a louder voice than I thought, and I am the President of the Committee for the Environment and Infrastructure, so that is the political lead for all things to do with environment and infrastructure, including climate change, energy, waste, transport, you know, just a few little topics like that. So it keeps me very busy. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. My name's Stephanie Glover. I'm Head of Strategy and Sustainable Finance for Guernsey Finance. For those who are unfamiliar with Guernsey's financial services sector, so we're a large international finance centre. We have around 300 billion in regulated funds, a growing investment management sector, a large private wealth sector, and insurance sector as well. We are number 1 in Europe for captives and have a large reinsurance and ILS section as well. So my role is promoting those financial services sectors and also encouraging them to be more sustainable in their approaches, so attracting sustainable finance capital into the island and investing into the rest of the world.
And Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Barnes. I'm the Head of Energy and Climate Change for the States of Guernsey, so I'm the lead civil servant for those areas, which means that I'm basically in charge of setting and implementing the strategies and policies of the states that relate to everything that touches on the climate change area and in particular focus on the energy area.
Thanks very much. So let's kick off. Lindsay, can I ask you, what is the circular economy from the Guernsey perspective?
Well, I think it's easiest to explain in contrast to the linear economy, which I'm sure people are familiar with. So essentially, when you boil it back down to its basics, it's resources being extracted from the ground and then going through a series of processes, you know, refinement, manufacturing, and all of those processes involve energy and emissions. And then there's use, and then ultimately in a linear economy model, it ends up quite often just going back into the ground. And certainly that's what our waste strategy used to be. The circular economy is obviously all about making the best possible use of resources. So instead of having a line, which is a very wasteful way of doing things, making it into a circle and keeping the resources that we've already got and that we're already using in use and being useful for as long as possible. So it really is about making the most of what we've got and avoiding the need to take more virgin resources out of the earth and using them wisely in the process.
Thank you. And Steph, can I come to you? And can you talk about this from a financial services perspective and maybe the differences and similarities there?
Yes, I think it follows very similar principles within the sustainable finance, embracing of circular economy financial principles. So I think those principles around moving away from that take, make, dispose economy to a more circular, using the waste products to profit maximize is very similar within the financial services. We've kind of seen the evolving of 2 main financial services products in this space. So I think firstly, we have sustainability-linked bonds, so these, or sustainability-linked loans. So in 2022, for example, Carrefour launched a first sustainability-focused linked bond, and that was 1.2 billion, and that was solely focused on circular economy and food waste reduction. there is very specific targets that they had under that bond. So they had to reduce food waste by 50% from 2015 to 2025. But those in Guernsey we're slightly more familiar with is in those private equity funds and the private finance investment in circular economy. And I think where we're seeing that in Guernsey at the moment, it fits under that broader ESG, sustainable finance umbrella term, and then embracing those circular finance principles, both to reduce the risk, but also to then hopefully maximise some profit in there as well.
Lovely, thank you. So, as I said at the top of the session, Guernsey has created a world-leading waste reduction and recycling programme, embracing the circular economy. Lindsay, can you tell us a little bit more about that? What is the Guernsey strategy and how it was developed, and perhaps some of its key achievements, please?
Yeah. It's been a very, very long process, actually. It wasn't something that was implemented or designed quickly. And basically, Guernsey has got, it's a beautiful island. We've got a lot of granite in the island, and we've also got a history of quarrying. And one of the outcomes of that is that we also had a lot of holes in the ground. And so for decades, people were just putting waste into these convenient holes in the ground without really thinking about it. So we have got a legacy of landfill. And towards the end of the 90s, it became clear that that was not only unsustainable, but we were also, in a more practical sense, running out of suitable holes in the ground. So we really had to think about how to do things a bit more differently. And the politicians at the time, and we are going back a good sort of 20 years here, did what many politicians often tend to do, which is reach for the engineering solution. You know, there was a solution that was neatly packaged on a plate and handed in. Yes, it was expensive, but it was shiny, and you know, we were promised it was going to work. I wasn't a politician in those days, incidentally, but an energy from waste plant was you know, that was the proposed strategy. But it went down really, really badly with the island community, especially because it was so much more over-spec'd. You know, it was such a big bit of kit to feed, and we knew that it would go against some of our very sort of frugal instincts, I think, because we would have to feed the beast. You know, it would only work at an optimum level if we kept putting enough waste into it. And that was really what grated. And so the community basically gave the politicians a very clear message that that was not going to go down well. And the politicians went away and they thought about it. And then some years later came back with exactly the same proposal, but smaller. But that was still too big. And the community was convinced that we could really drive down the waste volumes, because by this stage, we'd really got the message that the more waste you create, the more money you have to spend as a government, and that means as a taxpayer. And so, you know, we thought, well, we're quite good at being resourceful. I think lots of islanders are. So there was a real drive to do something that was less wasteful. And when the second proposal was also rejected, the politicians were slightly despairing, but they said, fine, you know, if the community knows better, then let's go and ask them. And so they actually embarked on a huge consultation process, and they got a really, really broad range of stakeholders from around the island, and went into huge amounts of detail and said, well, what do you want, and how do you think we're going to best get there? And what came out of it was a really fantastically robust strategy that we knew had a lot of community buy-in, and it's based on the waste hierarchy. So the number one priority is preventing waste from arising in the first place, because the less waste we have, the less of a problem we have to deal with. So prevention is the main aim of the strategy, and then it's about minimizing any waste that does arise, and then repairing and reusing. And then we get to recycling, which is what tends to get a lot of the attention, but it's not nearly as important as those upper tiers of the hierarchy. And finally, disposal as a last resort. And I'm pleased to say that it was a long process, but by the time we implemented it in a phased approach. And the first year of full implementation, we smashed through our 2030 recycling target, which we'd set at 70%. So we got 73% recycling rates in the first year. And we also, I think more impressively from my perspective, we achieved an 11% overall reduction in waste volumes all in the round. So it was fantastically successful, and it was all because it came from the community in the first place.
And that is fantastic, you know, to see that the policy that you implemented was actually, you know, nudging at an open door there as far as the community is concerned. But what were the roadblocks? Were there any roadblocks in encouraging the community in Guernsey to embrace the strategy?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to get behind a high-level idea, but when it comes to the practical implementation, that's when the rubber really hits the road and people start thinking about it and it becomes a bit more real. And the system was also based, I mean, it's very simple and straightforward in a way. We wanted to encourage the things, the outcomes that we were trying to achieve and discourage the outcomes that we didn't, we wanted to avoid. So we made all the good things like, reusing and repairing and recycling as easy and convenient as possible and kept them free. But we did introduce eventually a charge for disposal, so waste disposal. But it was a really, really big systemic change. I mean, we'd gone from a very rudimentary waste system, really, to one that was far more sophisticated. And instead of going for the technological solution as was originally proposed, we went for something which relied on societal change. And change can be really scary. So there was a huge education piece that had to go alongside that. We did take it carefully. It was it was a process that I'm glad that all the people involved took their time. We didn't rush to do a big step change and do, all the change in one go, because that wouldn't have worked. So we sort of eased it in, we phased it in, and people gradually became more comfortable with some of the elements and got more confidence that it was going to work. And there was there were a lot of questions about the practicalities on the way. We did road test those. We had lots of focus groups. This was community-led, from its inception, really. So we kept going back to the community to say, well, this is what we've got in mind. Do you think it's going to work? And so we were fairly confident that it would work, but we had to provide a lot of information and a lot of reassurance on the way. Any change is going to meet resistance. And I have to hand it to all the people who got behind, answering endless questions online. There were teams of people just very patiently on Facebook and things like that, just answering questions. We used to take road shows to the supermarkets and all the sort of local community events, and we'd have a presence everywhere. And people would come up and chat. They got very, very familiar with the faces behind the campaign, and it really paid off.
That's really great to hear, and it's interesting, isn't it, that it is a journey, and it's a sort of 10-year overnight success, really. So can we talk about the financial and maybe the non-financial savings that have come from Guernsey embracing this element of the circular economy, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think there are two ways you can look at it, really. One is from a government level, which is obviously something that is very much my my problem to deal with when it does cost government, and money is tight across lots of governments right now. We have saved tens of millions of pounds by not going for the admittedly easier, from a government's perspective, shiny technological solution. So that translates into saving households money as well, because obviously that would have to be funded ultimately from the taxpayer. So that is a saving not to be sniffed at, and I think it's one that we really do appreciate. But I think also at a household level, some of the more interesting aspects of the systemic change that we introduced was that people are just much more conscious about what they are doing. And I think this wasn't something that we set out to achieve, but I think it has achieved it. I think we have ended up saving individual households money as well, just because they've become so much more aware of some of their habits. And I'll take myself as an example, actually. I'm a mum to 4 children. And when we were just scraping kitchen scraps into a black sack of rubbish, it just disappeared, and we had no idea how much we were creating. But one of the things we did, we separated out the waste streams that it made sense to separate out, and one of those was food. And when we introduced little kitchen work surface caddies. So instead of scraping your food into the black sack, you would scrape it into a little kitchen caddy. And every time you open the caddy, you would see exactly what you'd wasted. And the typical family can waste up to £800 in a year on food that they buy and don't eat. But as soon as you become aware of it, you change your habits, you change your shopping habits, you change what you put in your children's lunch boxes, and you change how you treat leftovers. And there was a big education program around food waste in particular, because it is such an environmental problem as well, obviously. And you just don't want, irrespective of what happens to the waste at the end of the day, you don't want to have to waste resources going into something that is not, being useful. So there's been a big, and I do recommend it, there's a website called Love Food, Hate Waste. It's a great campaign. You can get all sorts of tips about what to do with your leftovers and how to store food and lots of things like that, portion awareness, waste-aware shopping. So that's fantastic. So I think it really has changed the way that people live, and I'm happy to say the community has really embraced it. But I think it has saved individual households just because of that change of habit, as well as avoiding a much more expensive sort of island-wide solution as well.
And it's good to see those tangible benefits. Steph, I'd like to come to you now. Can you give some examples of Guernsey investment funds investing in energy and the circular economy? And maybe you could talk a little bit about the challenges of financial services investing in the circular economy.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start with the challenges, and then I can come to kind of the opportunities and the good wins there. And I think when you compare the financial services to a government, those cost reductions for a government are obviously fantastic, and businesses and financial services are also looking to make cost reductions, and that's great from the circular economy, but they're also trying to focus on that profit maximization. So I think in terms of financial services, trying to understand where that profit maximization comes from the circular economy principles and themes, I think that is a key challenge. I think also looking at the more traditional investors, ESG, sustainable investing, while to those in the room may feel like it's been around for 20, 30 years, for traditional investors, that still feels quite new. So I think they're still grappling with how do we report on non-financial returns and trying to understand what investors are actually looking for, what are the key KPIs that an investor actually cares about and is looking for, and how can the fund manager deliver those. So I definitely think that's been a real challenge. The newness of this emerging asset class, and it definitely is an emerging asset class, and we're seeing new funds, new bonds, new loans emerging, but it's still new, and for some traditional investors, that's a fantastic opportunity. If you're more in the venture space or the emerging private capital space, that's a really exciting opportunity, but also presents massive risk. So I think for the more traditional investor who's starting to grapple with ESG and sustainable finance investing, circular economy is it's still too niche for them to really understand. I think anyone working in the sustainable finance space as well is going to hate me for saying, but it's the reporting, the requirements, and it's the regulation as well. And I think the financial services businesses really band behind clear regulation and clear reporting requirements. And on circular economy, we don't yet have clear reporting requirements in that regulation space. There are elements of circular economy built into some of the reporting requirements. So under the EU taxonomy, there is a line in there about circular economy, and it's one of the 6 environmental objectives of the EU taxonomy. So you can use circular economy themes to meet your EU taxonomy guidelines, but it's one of the 6, and it's one of probably the smallest 6 in there. So that kind of limited regulation, I think limited reporting, can also add to a risk of greenwashing. If you're telling your investors that you're embracing the circular economy and you're delivering food waste reductions, if you don't have a clear reporting requirement that you can then transfer across, it's really hard for investors and asset managers to communicate to those investors exactly what that saving is and exactly why they should care about that non-financial return. So I think that's a real challenge for the financial space. And I think lastly, the actual bankable, investable projects that are available in this space that, one, reduce the risk and also profit maximize and deliver financial returns to the investors, there is just a small availability of those projects. We see the large banks, the large private equity funds really looking for those investable projects, and they're really excited when there is a really investable project to invest in. Everything that I'm going to discuss in a minute on the Guernsey side, these funds are oversubscribed, they're doing really well, they're making financial returns, but there just aren't that many of them yet. So I think it's helping those small-scale projects scale up and become investable opportunities for private equity firms. So I think those are probably my main challenges for financial services in embracing circular economy as part of the broader ESG sustainable finance landscape. But I do want to chat about a couple of the really good Guernsey examples of ones that are embracing this.
Tell us.
Because there's some good ones in there. So One of them is a company called Earth Capital. So they are a London-based fund business, but their cornerstone investor is a Guernsey-based family office, and they also are looking to set up some Guernsey funds as well. So they invest in a company called Black Dog Biogas. So they use local food waste and local silage, which they then gather, and then it produces local energy. So it's really exciting for those communities to see their local food waste being used and producing the local energy. And that now powers about 1,000 homes. So it's small scale, but it's definitely scalable in local communities. And I think especially looking at island nations, that's definitely then scalable for island nations as well. The second one, so more on that large scale private equity, is a fund called Kibus Fund, and they're part of ADM Capital, which is a very large private equity firm. So they invest mainly in this fund in food technologies, and they invest around £900 million. And one of those investments is in a company called Summerberry. So Summerberry invest in UK and Portugal-based, really high-quality blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries. And because those fruits have to be such high quality, there's obviously huge amounts of waste in there. So for the businesses, this was just written off as loss. So then for the financial services business to come in and then take that loss into that profit maximization is where financial services do brilliantly. So they partnered with a local biltong producing firm, and then they changed from producing biltong into producing fruit roll-ups, those kind of dried fruit products. So they were taking the waste from the Summerberry and then making up an entirely new company to then produce a profit from that food waste. So it's a really exciting example. And then the last one I have is Gresham House. So Gresham House also invests funds using Guernsey structures as well. And they have several examples of embracing the circular economy within their broad sustainable finance funds. So they have a British Sustainable Infrastructure Fund, for example, based in Guernsey. One of those where they use cooking oil, and it's used cooking oil, which you then can't use for human or animal food grade. So again, they then use that and turn it into energy through biogas. They also use medical equipment. So medical equipment is burnt and incinerated, and it has to be burnt and incinerated. And obviously, post-COVID, there was a huge increase in that amount of medicinal waste. So then they use the heat that's come from burning that to then produce local fuels as well. So there's lots, I think, on the fuel and energy side is where we're seeing most growth, but I think food technologies is going to be a really exciting growth area for these funds.
Some really innovative and diverse solutions that you've talked about there. Peter, thanks for your patience. I'd like to talk to you now about energy and how important is resilience and demand management of energy and the intersection of energy and the circular economy.
So, thank you. So I think it's the approach that we take with energy is very similar to the approach we take with waste, which is a hierarchical approach, which is basically try and reduce as much as possible your initial energy demand. Then when you do need energy demand, use it as efficiently as possible. Then can you do multiple things with that energy that you're using, and then look at how can you produce that energy more climately friendly, so renewable energies, renewable fuels, and then finally bottom of the pile is the traditional way of burning something to get your energy. So that's very much a vital cornerstone of the island's energy policy, and that's translated through to our electricity strategy as well, whereby we're looking at increasing the amount of renewable energy we have on island. We already have about 95% of our electricity is met by decarbonised sources, although that is majoritarily through an interconnect that we have with France, which provides most of our energy. So there's definitely an independence piece there around that, which also adds to the security and resilience of the supply that we're looking for. So that's very important, but equally what's really, really important in the whole circular economy piece is that first piece of how do we reduce and manage that energy load. So again, we've been looking at, from an electricity perspective, we have large peaks and troughs in our electricity supply, as most people do, day-night cycle, and it's even more pronounced during the winter months when you have heating added into that in our geography anyway. And so there's two types of demand management. There's the demand management which looks to flatten that load, which means that you don't have to make additional investment in infrastructure, because you can manage the load and get a flatter load rather than installing additional generators or additional solar or additional interconnection. You can look to say, actually, if we can almost in effect double the amount of electricity we can produce over the long term, but not increase the amount of capacity needed to provide that. That's a win, because you're going to be therefore enabling more to happen in the jurisdiction over time without having to have the large capital outlay that comes with backing that up with additional generation. But then there's the other side as well, which is how do you actually reduce that load? So there's all sorts of things that everyone's doing, like light fittings and so forth. But in Guernsey as well, we're looking at energy efficiency of buildings. We've got quite a broad range of building types in the island. We've got traditional houses are made from granite, which actually thermal efficiency of is very good, but for the fact that they tend to not be very well insulated around the windows and doors, so you get a lot of draft exclusion through a lot of draft loss and heat loss through draft there. So they could actually be, in some ways, quite easy to fix. But then we've got a lot of pre- and post-war buildings which are not made of the nice thermally efficient granite and not made to the modern standards of insulation, and they're really the big problem that we're going to have to fix, because there's a lot of them. And they're very thermally inefficient. So, addressing that is a big problem that we're going to have to do. But that's really important as part of managing that energy and part of that circular economy. And it benefits the island, because the island doesn't have to invest in much in its infrastructure, and it benefits the individuals because they don't have to pay for the additional energy that they're no longer requiring to use. So yeah, that's really, really important on both sides.
Thank you. So we are on the Island of Hope stage, and obviously islands tend to be small communities. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Do smaller communities, and in particular island communities, exert a greater influence and have a greater awareness of finite resources, such as land for waste disposal, than larger communities? Lindsay, I'd like to ask you, how can larger communities overcome the challenges of the behavioural change that we were discussing earlier to successfully move to a circular economy?
Yeah, I think there is something really specific to islands, and I feel I can only really speak for my own island community, but I suspect that a lot of these things are transferable to other island communities, because I think there are some commonalities that cut across all island communities, and I think we are just more aware, as you alluded to, Rosie, of our resources, because quite often we are dependent on resources, and we are very finely attuned to situations when those resources might not be available. But also, I think if you take waste as an example, so we used to landfill our waste, and it's a small island with very tight space constraints. There's not a lot of land. So in the days when we were putting things in our bin, and those bin bags were going straight into an old quarry, into a hole in the ground, we all knew exactly where our waste was going. We all knew where it was. We all knew what it looked like. We all knew what it smelt like. And we were all aware of what might get blown out of that and into the very nearby beach environment and marine environment. So I do think that we have a much more direct relationship with our environment, which really can be harnessed to help motivate people to change, because it was so much more visceral, so much more tangible than I think it would be in perhaps a bigger community where these things are more of an abstract concept, where things just disappear and you've got no idea what happens to them. So I think what that speaks to is awareness. And if your question was really about what can larger communities do, I think if you can bring it to life for people and make them understand that it's not just an abstract concept, these things have real world direct impacts. And even if it's on a slightly wider environment than their very localized environment, I think being a small island, we're very hyper aware of changes to or impacts on our own island environment. But I think that awareness is key. But I think one of the other things that has really helped us through a period of change, when we've been asking people really to do things quite differently, has been that we've got high social capital. We're a very, it's a lovely island, it's a small community, as I know many island communities are, and it's very high trust, very strong social bonds between people. And I think that's an incredible asset, because that can really be harnessed to help drive change, because if people can understand that what you're asking them to do, change is always difficult, isn't it? But if you're asking them to change for an obvious and tangible benefit to their own environment and their own community, it's so much easier. So I think that really comes back to the education piece and making sure that you are giving the people the information to make sure that they understand why change is a good thing. I mean, obviously, change is scary for people, but if you can really stress why change is necessary and what the benefits are, then I think that really helps the process along the way.
So you kind of mentioned it, education. How important has it been in nudging the community to engage with that circular economy sort of shift?
Massively, massively. I think if we'd tried to move too quickly, we would have had a very different outcome. And so I think the education piece went hand in hand with a very steady, phased implementation. And we left the things that might have seemed very scary till last. So, for example, we were asking people to pay for the first time to, make a direct payment that was commensurate to the volume of waste that they were throwing out. And that was, when that was first suggested, that could have gone horribly, horribly wrong. But because we did the things that made life easier first, so we made recycling easier, we made, put a big focus on, things like repair and reuse. And we did all the friendly things that made life more convenient, that still delivered really important outcomes. And we implemented those first, and we did it in a gradual way. And there were just, tireless education campaigns. And we use people from within the local community as well. So I was talking a little bit earlier about food waste and how important that is. And actually we used local food-related celebrities, I suppose. So a lot of our local chefs are very well known within our community, and we use them for a localized campaign to really help get the message out. So I think it was about keeping the information obviously understandable and relevant, and keeping the implementation in pace with the education, I think, made all the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Steph, what suggestions would you have for other island nations to enhance climate finance on their own islands?
I'm going to build firstly on what Lindsay was saying around education. I think education has been really important to how we embrace sustainable finance in Guernsey. And I think particularly on the sustainable finance space, what's really difficult is you're educating people who are on a huge range of understanding on sustainability issues. So I don't want to teach, the really innovative impact investment manager what ESG stands for, but I don't want to then lose maybe the family office who are considering these principles for their families for the first time. So that's definitely been a challenge. So I think making sure that we're teaching these principles to those people who are maybe on an earlier stage of the journey, whilst really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of what these reporting requirements are going to look like for asset managers in 3 years' time, for those forward-looking asset managers. So I think trying to balance what those educational principles will look like and making sure that you're not leaving too many people behind on the journey as you kind of really support those front runners as well. So education's been so important, and we've just launched a education course on sustainable finance in Guernsey. And I think we have quite a unique financial services sector. I mentioned our expertise in private equity, in infrastructure, in private wealth management, in insurance. And those are quite unique sectors. So whenever I've done ESG or sustainable finance courses myself, they're quite general. So you end up speaking about what large banks are doing or what large insurers are doing, and it's quite hard then to bring it down to exactly what island financial services need and what international finance centre finance knowledge needs. So for us, developing and using those front runners and using them as guides for the people who are still coming on their journey, to use their expertise and their knowledge to then help people on the island in a really in-person environment, I hope that's going to be really powerful, and I'm really excited about the opportunities that course brings. So I think, building on education, that's going to be so important, particularly in new emerging asset classes like the circular economy. But also, I guess, building on what Lindsay said on that social capital of islands is so important. And I can't emphasize enough, in places like Guernsey, when you're walking down the road and you walk past, the head of a fund management company or the leader of a family office or the regulator themselves. And that happens all the time. And people, I think, are blown away by that when they come to Guernsey. So it's so easy for us, for a first-time fund manager who's setting up a fund for the first time, looking into the natural environment or circular economy, and they don't quite know what that looks like or what reporting requirements they would have to do or what type of fund structure they could build. It's so powerful for them when they come to a small island community to be able to walk in and meet the regulator and ask them directly what they need to do. And then just down the road is the law firm, and then 2 minutes away is the fund administrator. So embracing that island social capital where you know everyone on the island and you know who's the best person for this, that's so powerful. I also think within sustainable finance, we almost have an island-like community spirit as well. So in Guernsey, we've been members of the United Nations Financial Centres for Sustainability since about 2018. And using that as a real knowledge-sharing platform has been so powerful for us. And there's people in those rooms that we're learning from. We're learning, looking to say the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and then applying that to our local stock exchange, the knowledge learned there. And then we've been sharing our regulatory regimes. We have some excellent regulatory regimes around green funds and natural capital funds. So sharing that with the international community as well. And it's a really lovely space to work in because everyone wants to knowledge share. So I think that the social capital of islands and then the social capital of the sustainable finance space is something that other nations can really embrace and really enjoy.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Peter, what future developments do you hope Guernsey can make in the circular economy with regard to energy management?
So as I mentioned earlier, we're working quite hard now on looking at our energy efficiency of buildings piece of work. That's a really, really important piece for us to do because that's tackling that first piece of how do you use less energy, which in the circular economy context is well, in all contexts really, it's vital. And I think that plays across the energy sector as well. When you look at vehicles, yes, as Steph touched on earlier, you can start looking at biofuels, and that's something that's already happening on the island. It's something we can look to embrace more. And also, as an island, Guernsey's relatively small. Was it 25 square miles? It's a small place, perfect for electric vehicles. But you know what else it's perfect for? Bikes, walking. And so and we do have a transport strategy that really prioritises those as well. And I think it's really important to build on that social capital, to utilise that social capital that we have, that we've shown through the waste changes that can really help drive the projects forwards to look at the best ways to harness that. And also it has to be working with the communities, not forcing them to do things necessarily, but giving nudges in the right direction as well. That will really help to develop that. So it's that those big ticket items like how do we improve the overall energy efficiency of buildings, but also how do we continue to work in the right way to nudge people into using the more sustainable transport choices that we have available and are very fortunate in being a small island that should be quite attractive as well.
We certainly hope so. Anyway, so we've got a couple of minutes left, and I would like to ask everybody one more question. I'd like to ask you all the same question, and I'd like to start with Steph, please. What would you like other island communities to take from this session to further their own sustainability objectives?
So I'll talk, maybe I can do two, and
Yeah.
I'm going to steal it from
You go
Lindsay
for
and
it.
Peter and really annoy them when
You've
I've
got the
stolen
mic,
their
Steph.
answers.
Go for it.
I think on the finance side, that community building has got to be really, really important. I think learning from other centres and other islands has been so valuable for us. I think we are so unique as islands and then so similar to each other in certain ways. So I think that's embracing those differences, but also kind of encouraging us to share ideas. That would be the one thing that I would definitely encourage other islands to do. And then from an island side, I'm not going to steal your answer, hopefully, but I think just embracing that real community feel of islands, and I think now being a bit quite far from home, embracing the connection that you have with nature on islands, embracing that you can see the climate change that's affecting you on islands. I think really living locally and I think really feeling that is so powerful. And I think if you embrace those principles, then embracing sustainable finance becomes so much easier.
Absolutely. Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to build on that, really, I think it's islands are very fortunate to have that real social capital. Generally, you're very close to the decision makers. You're very close to the regulators. You can bump into them in the street, and it's not an unusual occurrence, especially an island the size of Guernsey. But even bigger islands, you have that much closer connection to the decision makers, that much more influence, that much more community feel than a larger jurisdiction. So that's really something that you can use as an advantage to delivering change. And like I say, like I mentioned, like Lindsay mentioned, it's not about enforcing change. It's about having the right conversations, using that education piece through that, and using that social capital to really help drive the change forward that everyone really agrees you want to make.
Lindsay, over to you. Last words, please.
Yeah, Steph did do quite a good job of stealing my answer, but she's absolutely right, and so is Peter. And really, I think what it boils down to is that I think what we all have in common as islands is that what a fantastic resource our communities are, what a fantastic group of people, tend to live there. And actually, when Peter was talking, it reminded me of one of the changes that I'm most proud of, and it wasn't a government-led change at all. My children, my younger children, go to a primary school who decided that they'd had enough of the roads around their street being, filled with cars and all the rest of it, and they decided to change it. And they were absolutely phenomenal. They campaigned for a different setup. They actually persuaded people that I never thought they would persuade to actually shut the road along where their school is. And they had a huge drive. They went and engaged with all the local, businesses and hotels and things nearby and said, hey, can we borrow a bit of your parking so that people don't have to drive near the school? And they put in place this amazing system. And as a result, we now have more than 9 in 10 of every child going to that school. I'll put it another way. Fewer than 1 in 10 children are now driven to that school. And that was a huge, huge change. And that all was because the children themselves led it. And so really, that is my key message, is embrace the change. Change can be scary, but if you can get the community behind it, then they can achieve anything. And I really do think that speaks to what we're all here for. You can become an island of hope.
Oh, that's magnificent. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our panellists today, Lindsay de Sommeray, Stephanie Glover, Peter Barnes. If you'd like further information on Guernsey, you can look at what the government is doing at gov.gg and what we are doing at weareguernsey.com. Thank you very much for listening.